Welcome, everyone. My name is Professor David Brodsky. I'm the chairperson of the Department of Judaic Studies at Brooklyn College. And as with last week, I am playing tech support today. So Professor Sharon Flato, our professor of early modern Judaism, and who's offering a course on Hasidism in the fall, will be introducing our guest speaker.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Moshe, for not traveling, but still sharing so much of your time with us. This is the second lecture that we're hosting, and it's a real privilege. But before we thank Moshe, we want to acknowledge Frances Haight. She was a Brooklyn College alum from the year of '44, who worked and published in finance, and generously endowed an annual lecture in Judaic studies, which we try to use. Last year we could not use it because of the pandemic, but this year thankfully we can. In the past, her nephew, Jonathan Haight, has attended, but due to the pandemic, he can't be with us today, but hopefully he will be with us next year. Today, we have the particular privilege of hosting Professor Moshe Rosman as our Haight lecturer. As I said last time, but I know that many of you were not here last time, so I will repeat it. Professor Rosman is a distinguished professor of Jewish history at Bar-Ilan University. His areas of expertise include Polish Jewish history, Hasidism, which we'll hear about today, and Jewish historiography, and gender, which we heard about last lecture. He is the author of several trailblazing books, including The Lord's Jews, including A Quest for the Historical Baal Shem Tov, which we'll hear about today, and I hear there are new findings that we will that are looming and we'll be hearing about, and How Jewish is Jewish History. He also is working on a new project which will be published by Littman Press this fall, categorically Jewish, distinctly Polish. He also is a major contributor, Hasidism, A New History, which is a revisionist approach to to Hasidism. I can tell you that most of us until this were still using Gershom Shalom and a lot of classics, Dubno, but there's been a lot of new research, and this is incredibly helpful in terms of teaching and in terms of studying. So we thank Professor Rosman for that. You will not be surprised to hear that Professor Rosman is the author, is the recipient of many awards, including the National Jewish Book Award, and most recently the Rothschild Award in 2020. I said this last time. On a personal note, I feel indebted to Professor Rosman in various ways, even though he was never my professor and I never took a course with him. I've had the privilege of hearing lectures from him. And especially when I was a graduate student, he was always very generous to me and other young scholars. And as I said last week, unfortunately, that is not always the case. So I am particularly grateful to him. And in addition, I didn't get to mention this last week, Professor Rosman is not scared to speak truth to power, even in the academy where it's not always easy. So that is another thing I very much respect him and am grateful to him for. So without further ado, Professor Rosman.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, David. Thank you again for the invitation. So tonight we're going to speak about Yisrael Baal Shem Tov and the beginning of Hasidism.
I should just mention it's tonight for Professor Rosman. He is speaking to us from his office, I think in Jerusalem. Is that right?
Yes, it's 7:40 here, almost 7:40.
For many of us, it's 12:30, so 12:40.
So this is a famous painting, apparently by the American-British artist John Singer Sargent. It is of a Baal Shem Tov, but not the Baal Shem Tov. This is the Baal Shem of London, whose name was Shmuel Falk, who was actually born shortly before Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, the Baal Shem Tov that we're interested in as the founder of Hasidism, shortly before he died. So people are so thirsty for any trace of the Baal Shem Tov that this picture is often mistaken as a picture of our Baal Shem Tov. So just to set straight, this is not the Baal Shem Tov, also referred to as Besht, the acronym of Baal Shem Tov. This is the title page of the first printing of a book called Shivchei HaBesht, translated in praise of the Baal Shem Tov. This is a hagiographical collection of about 200 stories telling of the Baal Shem Tov's performances, his life, the miracles that he performed. And this has been one of the main, perhaps the main source of knowledge about the Baal Shem Tov's life. People always trying to separate the hagiography from the history that's in this book, taking the approach of kernels of historicity, trying to find the kernels. So tonight you're going to see, or this afternoon, you're going to see that there is hope to use other sources. So let's start with a story from Shivchei HaBesht. When the Besht came to the community of Międzyburz, that's the town in southeast Poland where he took up residence, the Hasidim, Reb Zev Kitzis and Reb David Purkis, did not consider him to be important because of the title Besht Baal Shem Tov that he was called, because this title is not fitting for a tzaddik. A tzaddik meaning a righteous man, a spiritual leader. Now, what's wrong with this story? First of all, we thought that the Baal Shem Tov came to Międzyburz and created Hasidism. But here we have Hasidim that are there already before he got there. And secondly, he was supposed to be the leader of this movement, but these Hasidim don't want to even accept him. So what's going on here? Some of you may be familiar with the term Hasidei Ashkenaz, the Hasidim or the pious of Ashkenaz. This was a group of pietists, Jewish pietists who lived in the 12th, 13th century in German-speaking lands, who were ascetics, who were mystics. This type of Hasidism, piety, has had a long history. It ebbed and flowed. In the 16th century, with the renaissance of Kabbalah in the city of Tzvat in the land of Israel, this type of Hasidut, this type of pietism based on Kabbalah and mysticism, had a rebirth and spread from Tzvat to Italy, then north to Germany, and then east to Poland. So by the 17th and 18th century, we had Hasidim, that is pietists in Poland, who behaved like the Hasidim in Tzvat. That is, they were ascetics, they were mystics, they organized in small conventicle groups where they would meet and study together and live a holy life. So there was Hasidism with a small ch before Hasidism, which is what we're interested in tonight, this afternoon. Now, it's often thought that the Baal Shem Tov put Międzyburz on the map. Well, today that's true. Today, the only reason non-residents of Międzyburz come there, and the only reason a tourist would come there, is because of the Baal Shem Tov. And in fact, in the 90s, the Ukrainian government where Mienzebuj is located today, wanted to make Mienzebuj a tourist attraction like Uman is, where thousands of Jews come on Rosh Hashanah and throughout the year to pray at the grave of Nachman of Bratslav. So they wanted the grave of the Baal Shem Tov to serve a similar purpose. And they put up a sign and it said, "Welcome to Mienzebuj, home of Israel Baal Shem Tov, founder of Judaism." Well, that's as far as the project went. But you see, Mienzebuj is in what was in the 18th century, Southeast Poland, what is today Western Ukraine. Now, Mienzebuj was not a small little shtetl, a village. Mienzebuj was an important provincial town. As you can see in this map, it stands at the confluence of two rivers, the Buzhik River and the Bo River. And it has a very imposing fortress that you can still see today that commanded the confluence of the rivers and hence the trade route going through this area. There was an army garrison there and trade caravans to both the east and the west would organize there. So the Baal Shem Tov came to Mienzebuj not to put it on the map, but because it was on the map. It was an important place. Now, we want to find out things about the Baal Shem Tov and compare them perhaps to what is told in Shivchei HaBesht, the collection of stories. So how would you Google someone in the 18th century? There's somebody who will always know who you are. And that somebody is the tax person, the tax collector. You can count on the tax collector to be able to find you. And so if we look at the tax records of Mienzebuj, it's likely that we're going to find the Baal Shem Tov. And in fact, you see here a page from the 1760 register of real estate taxpayers in Mienzebuj. And here, living in house number 93 is Baal Shem, Dr. Baal Shem Lieber. Well, Baal Shem is just a Eastern pronunciation of Baal Shem. Doctor means he was a healer, which of course is what a Baal Shem Tov is. A Baal Shem Tov is a shaman, somebody who can use the name of God to perform miracles, who can communicate with the divine realm, who can help people with their problems. So, and these problems can be both physical and spiritual. So Dr. Baal Shem Lieber, exempt from tax. He did not have to pay tax. Now, why is that? If we look at the tax registers for the years the Baal Shem Tov was in Mienzebuj, this is what we find. In 1739, in a house that is called by the Polish tax collector, Dom Kahalski, that is a house belonging to the Kahal, to the Jewish Council of Mienzebuj, the name in it, Moshko Duchovny. Moshko, we could translate as the clergyman. That is, Moshko was probably a cantor or perhaps a teacher, what in Hebrew we would call Kli Kodesh, a secondary spiritual figure. But in 1740, there's a new person in this house. Dom Kahalski, the house belonging to the Kahal, Su or Kantorsky, that is the house of the cantor, Vnim Kabbalista. A new person is here, and the tax collector knows what he is known by. He's a Kabbalist, a mystic. Now, since this house was tax-free, why was it tax-free? Because it belonged to the Kahal, belonged to the Jewish council, so they didn't have to pay the tax. So the tax collectors didn't always bother to record it. But in the years that they did record it, this is what we see. 1742, Baal Shem Domu Kahalskim, the Baal Shem in the house of the Kahal. 1758, they just wrote Baal Sam, which is Baal Shem. 1760, as we saw, Baal Shem Dr. Lieber. And 1763, a new person is in the house, Hershko Vdomya Kahalnim, Hirsch or Tzvi in the house of the Kahal. Now the Baal Shem Tov's son was named Hirsch. Maybe he continued to live there. We can't be sure. So the Baal Shem Tov lived in a house, rent-free and tax-free, that belonged to the Kahal. This tells us that, as opposed to how he was often portrayed in the past as a rebel against the establishment, as someone fighting the corrupt Kahal rabbinic establishment and standing up for the common man, what we can see from here is that the Baal Shem Tov was actually part of the establishment. He was probably invited to Mienzbush to be the Baal Shem there. Many communities had a Baal Shem, just like they had a doctor, they had a Baal Shem, a miracle worker, a healer, somebody who could help people with their physical and spiritual problems. So he was not a rebel. He fit in as a Hasid of the old style and performing a very conventional job to be the Baal Shem of Mienzbush. However, he wasn't that conventional. Apparently, he was also the head of the Beit Midrash in Mienzbush. Those two Hasidim that at first did not want to accept him, they were people who received a weekly stipend from the community, which implies that they were among the permanent members of the Beit Midrash. There probably was something between 5, perhaps a few more people who were full-time scholars, and the Baal Shem Tov was accepted and probably was the one to teach them, because what we do see from the stories of Shivchei HaBesht is that these two men, Zev Kitzes and David Purkis, were his lieutenants, would help him in whatever missions he had to undertake. So the Baal Shem Tov had a firm position in Mienzbush. He was respected. He was filling a role that was accepted. Within that, he began to preach things that were somewhat different. First of all, he was very much anti-ascetic. We have a letter that he wrote to one of his associates, Yaakov Yosef of Polna, where he comes out very strongly against asceticism. God doesn't want you to punish your body. God wants you to worship him out of joy of mitzvah, not out of suffering. He also believed in communing with the letters of the holy text. That is, the holiness resides in the very letters. A later Hasidic homily would say, if you took all the letters of the Torah as it is now and threw them up in the air, and they came down in a completely different order, it would still be just as holy, because the Baal Shem Tov taught that the holiness resides in the letters themselves. And when you study the text, your goal should be to get into the letter, to get to the root of the letter where the holiness resides. He also spoke of elevation of alien thoughts. If you think impure thoughts, let's say you think about sex, well, what you have to do is to elevate that thought and think about what sex, the potential that sex has. Sex has the potential to create new life, to serve God. Sex has the potential to express love. So his idea was, what's important is what you do with the thought. And worship through corporeality. It's not spelled correctly here. That is, you can worship God in many ways, not just through standing and praying or even studying, but whatever you're doing, if you do it with the proper kavanah, the proper intention, it can be worship. So your work can be worship. Your eating can be worship. If while you're doing it, you think of the divine nature of what you're doing. He also believed in kavanot, that is, meditative prayers before the formal prayers begin, to get into the proper frame of mind to pray. Now, the Baal Shem Tov, as I said, was probably the head of the Beit Midrash in Menzebuj. He had around him a circle, a chavura, not what we associate with later Hasidism, a court, a chatzer. He worked within the conventional accepted institutions, the synagogue, the Beit Midrash. He didn't start any kind of new institution. He also did not have thousands of followers. From what we see in Menzebuj, he had his family, of course, and there are 5 people in Menzebuj who are called of the Baal Shem. That is, they were identified by the taxpayers by their connection to the Baal Shem. So let's say that those 5 were leaders and there were another 20, but this is not a movement. Now, he also had a dozen or so people from outside of Menzebuj who were associated with him, who considered themselves his disciple, who would come and visit him. And he would also, as we'll see shortly, travel to see them occasionally. However, he did not start any new institutions. He did not do any significant scholarly writing. All we have is several letters that he wrote. And he did not propose any kind of program. So the Baal Shem Tov did not really start a movement. He originated these ideas. They weren't actually original. They existed in the tradition, but he packaged them and popularized them. And he organized his small coterie of disciples. The Baal Shem Tov died on the holiday of Shavuot, 1760. When he died, his circle did not stay together. And I should emphasize there were many such circles of Hasidim, the old type of Hasidim, the old type of Hasidim that originally Zev Kitsis and David Purkis were. One of the Baal Shem Tov's disciples was Dov Ber, who was a Magid, that means a preacher, from Mezerich, the town of Mezerich. Dov Ber organized his own chavura. However, unlike the Baal Shem Tov, he started a new institution, the court, the Chatzer. And this court was different from the chavurot, the circles that the old style Hasidim organized. First of all, it was open to anybody. Not only was it open to anybody, he apparently recruited people to come. He sent out members of his chavura to attract new people. Secondly, it was a dedicated institution, by which I mean it wasn't a synagogue that has many functions. It wasn't a Beit Midrash that is accepted as a place of study. It was an institution that was to serve his chavura and the new people who came. And he had to worry about financial arrangements. There had to be a way to support all these people coming to be part of the Chatzer. And we'll talk about the finances a little later. So Dov Ber innovated both institutionally, but also organizationally. First of all, he made the tzaddik, the leader of the Chatzer, as the focal point. And in Chatzer, there is a hierarchy. The closer you are to the tzaddik, the more prestige you have, the more important you are. And that's what people aspire to be close to him. And then there is the ritual of pilgrimage. People come from afar to sit at the feet of the tzaddik, to worship with the tzaddik, to eat with the tzaddik. They come on pilgrimage to be with the tzaddik. Some of them are privileged to have an interview, what's called yechidus, to be alone with the tzaddik, where they would tell him their personal problems. He would try to help them. He also, as we'll see shortly, instituted certain rituals. And unlike the Baal Shem Tov, whose way of teaching was apparently by telling stories, Dov taught by giving sermons, drashot, and we'll see a small example of that. There was a man named Shlomo Maimon, who was born in what is now Belarus in 1754. And he wrote his memoirs, and he tells us how smart he was, and he was smart. Later, he was a philosopher, and he wrote some important philosophical works. As a young man, he heard about the Magid and his chavura, and he decided to check it out. So he came to Mezerich, and he describes what he experienced there, and I'd like to read you a little bit of what he tells us. On Shabbat, I came to a magnificent feast. In the tzaddik's house was a group of distinguished people from various regions. Later, the tzaddik himself appeared in all his glory. He was dressed in white satin with white shoes. Even his snuff box was white. So we're getting a kind of ritual here. The leader dresses in white, which is a Kabbalistic custom. After he greeted his guests, we sat at the table. Throughout the meal, a holy silence pervaded. Another ritual, silence. Afterwards, the tzaddik began to sing, another ritual, an uplifting melody. He placed his hand on his brow in contemplation. Then he identified each guest by name and hometown. In other words, people he had never met before, he called them out. Chaim Yankel from Shklov, etc. And Shlomo goes on to tell us that he asked each person to give a quote from the Torah, and then he proceeded to weave on the spot, to weave together a drasha, a sermon, based on the verses cited by each of the people there. And as Shlomo says, we were amazed. Of course, he realized that part of this was thanks to the fact that the Magid's Shamash, his major domo, would interview everybody before the Shabbat and brief the Magid on who was there, where they were from. However, it still was quite a virtuoso performance. Now, with all of this innovation, there still was not any identification as a movement. This was still one from among many chavurot. It had a certain style. It was different in its style, but it was a different style of pietism. It was not a movement with a self-conscious identity. We're doing something new. It was another pietistic group, not the other. Which brings up the question of opposition. Now, I mentioned that the Baal Shem Tov had disciples who did not live in Menzibush, who were spread out geographically. And one of the places he had disciples was in the town of Ostrug. Now, this is a very interesting place. It was owned by two different noblemen who were not always in agreement as to how to administer this town. And having two different owners led to there being, in the end, really two different Jewish communities. Starting in the 1720s, there was lots of conflict within the Jewish community. By the 1740s, when it came to choosing a rabbi for at least one of the communities, there was opposition to the Kahal's choice of who should be the rabbi, to the establishment's choice. And the candidate who was against the establishment candidate was a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov and was supported by the Baal Shem Tov's disciples and by the Baal Shem Tov himself. And apparently, the Baal Shem Tov even came to Ostrog and preached and aroused the anger of the Kahal, who put him in cherem, who announced a ban on him. So there was some kind of opposition, but not to any kind of movement. This episode was really a question more of politics. Who's going to be the rabbi, and which candidate is going to be successful depending on which party, quote unquote, is successful. Perhaps there was also some kind of element of different approaches to Judaism, but we don't know anything about that. The real opposition to Hasidism starts when one of the Magid's disciples started his own chavurah in the town of Shklov. His name was Avraham from Kalisk. And rumors started circulating that Kalisk's disciples in his chavurah were behaving in unacceptable ways. I say boys will be boys. What do I mean? Well, they did the terribly immodest things like standing on their heads or standing on their hands so that their kaftans dropped down and you could see their undergarments. They did somersaults while they were praying. They were rude to scholars. And the rumor was that they propounded a heretical interpretation of one of the passages of the Zohar, the basic book of Jewish Kabbalah mysticism. We don't know which passage. In Vilna, this man, the Gaon of Vilna, heard about this. Now, the Gaon of Vilna is a member of what I call the all-time rabbinic all-star team. One of the most famous rabbis who ever lived. His name was Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman of Vilna. He wrote very important halachic works. He never had a formal position, but he had tremendous moral authority. He also was called not just Gaon, but Hasid. He was called Gaon v'Hasid. Hasid in the sense of the old type of Hasidim who did not want to accept the Baal Shem Tov. In other words, he was a mystic and an ascetic, in addition to being one of the greatest halachists and Talmudists who ever lived. When he heard about what was going on in Shkov, he became angry, and he decided these people were not just another type of Hasidut. They are the other. They are not really Hasidim at all. He called them mit Hasidim. That is, people who make themselves as if they are Hasidim, or people who are hypocrites. They're not really Hasidim. And he defined them as a sect. They are not part of this mainstream pietism, this mainstream Hasidut. They are a totally different sect. They are heretical. Their writings should be destroyed. They should be put into cherem, that a ban should be declared against them. And in fact, in several places, haramot, bans, were issued. And a book of these bans was published. The book was called Zamir Aritzim V'Charvot Surim. Zamir Aritzim V'Charvot Surim. This book collected all of the bans that had been declared against these new Hasidim, these mit Hasidim. And what are they accused of in the documents in this book? Well, first of all, they're accused of separating from the synagogue, holding their own prayer groups, their own minyanim, worshiping themselves, separating from the congregation, and doing it using not the Ashkenazic rite, but the Lurianic rite, which incorporates all sorts of Kabbalistic elements. They also would pray at unconventional times. In particular, they would delay the afternoon prayer, the mincha prayer, until they were in the proper frame of mind. And sometimes they would wait too long and start praying even after sunset, when this prayer should be said before sunset. They would indulge in all sorts of indecorous gestures, as we talked about just a few minutes ago, and pray with too much enthusiasm. Another thing was they used sharpened knives for kosher animal slaughter. This is a little complicated. Kosher slaughter, shchita, is supposed to cause as little pain as possible to the animal, which means you need your knife to be as sharp as it can possibly be. However, before the invention of steel, you had to make a choice. Your knife was either perfectly straight or perfectly sharp. If it was perfectly sharp, it couldn't be straight because the iron would be too thin. If it was perfectly straight, it couldn't be perfectly sharp because the iron would be too thick. The accepted Ashkenazic style of shechita was to be perfectly straight. So there would be no curves in the knife that could catch on the animal's skin. The Hasidim took the other point of view that the knife had to be perfectly sharp so that there were no nicks in the blade that might catch on the animal's skin. It's kosher, but it's not the accepted Ashkenazic style of what was then the accepted Ashkenazic style of slaughter. They were accused of being preoccupied with purity and ecstatic prayer, with finding too many excuses to celebrate and drink, and for having contempt for traditional scholars. They were called Sabbatians, Frankists, that is heretics. But note, all of the things they were accused of, there's nothing there that's ideological. They weren't accused of having any heretical ideas or of threatening any existing institutions, with the exception of the slaughter, the shechita. But there we're talking about money. Whoever controlled the shechita in a community controlled the fees that were paid. When people brought a chicken to be slaughtered, they had to pay, and that money went to the whoever controlled the community. Now, what was so the opposition began? This we're talking now in the early 1770s, when the Gaon came out with his herem against the Hasidim. It was in 1772. How did the Hasidim react? Well, Dov Ber, the Maggid, sent two of his disciples to the Gaon to try to explain to him, we're not heretics, we're not Sabbatians, we are Hasidim like you, just a little different emphasis. So two of his disciples, Shneir Zalman and Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, went to visit him. The Gaon refused to even admit them. He would not meet with them, would not hear them out. Subsequently, the Maggid, shortly before he died, called his disciples together to his home then at Rovna. And it seems it was here that they finally realized what they're doing is something different, something new, something that had been developing all through the 1760s. By now, being defined by the Baal Shem, by the Gaon as the other, as the enemy, made them realize that they have to adopt this identity and develop it. So what is our identity? So through the 1770s, 80s, and 90s, what we find is the Hasidim experimenting in different dimensions of their developing movement. So the first question was, how should our chavurot be organized? How should our groups be organized? And there were different models. One model was to keep it as an elitist circle, just like the old style Hasidim were, like the Baal Shem Tov circle was. And two leaders, Yaakov Yosef of Polonia or Polona, and Pinchas of Koretz, kept their groups as small, elitist, learned people. As we saw already, both the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid, when they died, their circle, in the case of the Besht, and the court, in the case of the Maggid, disbanded. They didn't continue. On the other hand, the Maggid's grandson, Shalom Shachna, and great-grandson, Yisrael of Ruzhin, last name was Friedman, built up what we call the regal style court, a court that consisted of a home that was a kind of mansion with a carriage, with horses, eating the finest food, dressing in the finest clothing, and attracting a mass of followers. So here we can already talk about the Hasidic movement with the regal style court. And then there were leaders, early Hasidic leaders with no court. Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev was the rabbi in 3 places, Zelichov, Pinsk, and Berdichev. He made his living as a rabbi. He was the rabbi of the town, the rabbi of everyone, not just the Hasidim. He never had a Hasidic court. He was important as a preacher. He wrote 2 books. He was a Hasidic thinker, but he was never a tzaddik with a court. The same thing of Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl, another important Hasidic preacher and writer. He was an itinerant preacher going from town to town. He never had a court. And then there were long distance courts. Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, Avraham of Kalisk, whom we met already. In 1777, they decided to make Aliyah to the Holy Land, to come to Eretz Yisrael, and they tried to lead their Hasidim back in what Jews would call Lithuania, Lita, today is Belarus. They tried to lead them long distance through letters. Well, it didn't work. And the courts eventually dispersed. And then there was the idea of the main court with branch courts. Yisrael of Ruzhin, who I just mentioned, and Chernobyl, I mentioned before. There was a main court, and then the Rebbe or the Tzaddik's sons would go out and start their own courts some distance away. So you had a network of Ruzhin Hasidim or Sadigora Hasidim or Chernobyl Hasidim. And then there were courts that died out, like 2 of the Maggid's disciples, Elimelech of Lizhensk and Chaim Chaikel. After they died, their courts did not last more than a generation. And then, of course, the famous court that continued without any leader, the court of Nachman of Breslov, the Bratslaver Hasidim. After he died, they never again appointed a leader. And then who should be the leader if you do appoint a leader? Should it be a disciple, such as the Karliner Hasidim? It was a disciple of the first Rabbi, the first Tzaddik, Aaron HaGadol. His disciple Shlomo became the leader. Or should the son inherit? The son of Shneur Zalman of Ladi, also called Dov Ber, was the one who became the leader after Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, after he died. And then there were several issues that had to be resolved during this 30 or so year period. First of all, should membership in our Chavurah be restricted, as it was for Pinchas of Koretz and Yaakov Yosef of Polna? Or should there be open membership, open to anybody, that is any man, who wants to come? When the leader dies, should we disband, as the Besht and the Maggid circles did, or should we continue? And if we continue, what kind of leadership, hereditary or disciple? And what about financing? It seems that the court of the Maggid already developed a method of financing by which anybody who came, especially anybody who had a yechidus, anybody who had an interview with the rabbi, was expected to give what was called a pidyon, redemption money, which of course would be used for upholding, maintaining the court. In addition to this, we have something called the ma'amad, that is, all of the Hasidim who are associated with a certain tzaddik were expected to pay dues, to send a ma'amad payment every year for the maintenance of the rabbi and his court. And then we have to define the Hasid tzaddik relationship. That is the tzaddik an advisor or is he commander? Does he help people to decide what to do, or does he tell them what to do? And women, what is the role of women in Hasidism? This has become a very controversial topic. Officially, women are not Hasidim. They are in facilitative roles. Did they view this as their version of being Hasidot, of belonging to Hasidism by facilitating the activities of their men? In addition, women could have indirect yechidus, that is, without actually seeing the rabbi, they could present their problems and he might help them. And what about a literary canon, a set of writings, of books that tell us what is it that this Hasidism is all about? So, again, the Rebbe style, as I said, commander or advisor, prayer, ecstatic or what I'm calling normal, regal style of court or a modest style of court, folksy teaching or sermons, music or words. Now, I would claim that Hasidism was one of the modern movements of Judaism. We're used to thinking of Haskalah, of religious reform as being Jewish modern movements. Well, I think Hasidism is no less modern than they were, and perhaps in a way it was even more successful than they were. First of all, they had to frame Hasidism. What is it that we're doing? What is Hasidism all about? If you read the Maggid's book that was not published by him, but was published by his disciple who pieced together his teachings, Maggid Varav Yaakov, published in 1781. What is Hasidism all about? Well, Kabbalah flourished until the Ari, that is Yitzchak Ashkenazi, who was one of the leading Kabbalists in Tzfat in the 16th century. And then it languished until the Baal Shem Tov came along and revived Kabbalah. And then after him, the Maggid, who continued this revival. That's what Hasidism is. It's the recrudescence of Kabbalah. And they began publishing, printing books to spread the word. This is something very modern. New modes of organization. No more the kahal that you had to belong to and had to obey, but rather we now have a voluntary organization that has a center with a diffuse periphery. This is like a modern movement. You have the headquarters, the Chatzer, and then you have various chapters in different places that are loyal to the Chatzer. And once in a while, on holidays, you have what we might call conventions. That is, people come, make their pilgrimage to the Chatzer. And are reinforced in their association with the movement. This is modern. There are new sources of authority. Instead of the parnas, the elder of the kahal, or the rabbi, the halachist of the community, now authority resides in the tzaddik, the rabbi. New venues of authority. Instead of authority emanating from the synagogue or even the Beit Midrash, we have two new Hasidic institutions, the Chatzer and the Shtibel, the prayer room. So there's the Chatzer, which is the central headquarters, and the Shtiblach, located in various towns. And if you're a Hasid of a certain tzaddik, you worship, you daven in that Shtibel. And new politics. In the traditional Jewish community, the relations with the authorities were handled by the shtadlan, the lobbyist that was part of the communal establishment. Now, the rabbi was in charge of relations with the authorities, working through all sorts of connections in his own network. And new economics, as we said, the traditional community taxed people. Now people gave voluntary contributions to the court of the Hasid. So by the third decade of the 19th century, we find Hasidism is a developed movement. It had economic power. It had a large number of followers. It was spread geographically. It had political influence with the non-Jewish authorities. And it was able to maintain and perpetuate itself until today. So, while traditional scholarship was always focused on 18th century Hasidism, I would say that Hasidism came to its maturity in the 19th century. The Hasidism that we think about as fulfilling the roles that we associate with Hasidism, that came to fruition in the 19th century. The maturation of the Chatzer, the institutionalization of the tzaddik. Thank you very much.
Excellent job.
Thank you, Moshe. Sharon, you want to take over?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Rosman. As usual, a very informative and enlightening talk. We are lucky enough to be able to take about 15-20 minutes of questions if we have. So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand, or if you have that feature, if you have the icon that raises a hand, you could do that, or you could also send me a message in the chat, or send Professor Brodsky a message in the chat. So I see here a lot of other distinguished professors of Eastern European Jewish history and Hasidut, so I'm sure there will be questions and discussion. Who is brazen enough to begin? Lauren, you didn't know you had to be brazen to begin, right? Yaakov?
Yeah, hi. I wrote back a while ago a question to the professor. You mentioned the origination of this whole morphism from the ascetics. So we know from the time of Beit HaMikdash HaSheni, from the Second Temple time of the ascetics and the Essenes, which was that whole ascetic movement, etc. Is that the same kind of asceticism that sort of just gradually continued on for a good 1,200 years?
Well, you're talking about more than 1,200 years. You're talking more like 16 or 1700 years. Well, it's not a continual movement. I mean, asceticism has certain characteristics. You don't eat, you don't enjoy yourself.
That I understand, but I mean, can we sort of like, let me clarify. Can we understand that same movement that we know historically of asceticism, that is sort of just kept going in and out of Jewish geography, that essentially morphed
but asceticism
into.
doesn't just come in and out of Judaism. It's in many religions.
No, of course.
It seems to be an aspect of religion, but the asceticism we're talking about here, I think, stems from the Middle Ages, from Hasidei Ashkenaz. Now, what are their roots? That's a whole different question. But I don't see this as drawing on Second Temple asceticism.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Benjamin Rubin.
This may sound like a little bit marginal, but I'm interested in the grandson of the Besht, who had the court, also had a court jester, had the Herschel of Osterpol, the sort of Badchan, and he kind of played almost like a Shakespearean role, allowing a sort of questioning of this authority of the leader, or joking about it or poking fun at it. And it seems to be connected in some way, and that's a role that I don't think there was in the Mitnagdim kind of tradition. I'm just curious to know how that fits in.
I really don't know anything about Herschel Osterpoler except for the stories that you're alluding to. I don't have any historical research on him. I don't know anybody who's done it.
But Benjamin, are you asking more generally about the phenomenon of a Badchan and humor?
Well, the Badchan, Herschel
Well,
of
Baal Shem
Osterpol,
Tov himself seems to have used humor, both in the stories and even in his letters. You find a kind of sharpness, but in a humorous way, in a gentle way, that it seems to be somebody who could appreciate a joke. I can't say more than that.
thank you.
Yedidia. But Yedidia, you're on mute. It's always the computer science professors, right?
You always screw it up. Anyway, full disclosure, I'm one of the direct descendants of one of the people you were talking about. But
one,
the Bnei Yissaschar, third generation to Malcolm Milozensk.
okay.
But in any event, whose name was Langsam before he changed it to Spira. But in any event, you mentioned some of the reasons of possible opposition by the Gra, by the Vilna Gaon to the Besht and to Chassidim.
No, not to the best. He never knew the
later on.
best. He probably never, maybe he heard of him.
That's
I doubt
correct.
it.
To the next,
Best had been dead for 12 years already.
yes, to the movement. That's correct. To primarily to Chabad, maybe because
There was no Chabad yet. There was no
when
Chabad.
he came to the Vilna Gaon, and he turned him away, the leader.
Yes, but there was no Chabad movement
That's
yet.
correct. That's correct. But one of the three reasons, you gave some of these reasons. Possible, it was thought that there was some Shabtai Tzvi influence, and there's some evidence that they did have some of the secret writings, that books that they were protecting that may have been written by people who were friendly to or approved of the Shabtai Tzvi movement. Another reason was a social issue, the breaking down of versus well, maybe we have that in academia now, the way academics think that somehow or other we are leaders and the poor people have to follow us, and the movement came to say, no, the leaders, you're not. Scholarly work is not where it's all at, but joy and prayer is another reason. But there was also some doctrinal issues. In particular, there was a major disagreement between concepts of God. The issue,
What?
of God.
No.
Okay, of Tzimtzum, which was, I think, one of the things. I mean, the Vilna Gaon, who was also a big Kabbalist, also, and he believed strongly in the fact that God has sort of removed himself somewhat from this world, while Chabad's theology is that, as in the children's song, which they push very much, God is here, God is here, God is everywhere. In everything you will find God, in every leaf, in every, and the Vilna Gaon felt that that was heretical, that God would not concern himself with whether a leaf falls off a tree. And I wonder if you have any evidence, one, or it could be all combinations, but do you have any evidence to one of these reasons as being the primarily opposition? Because there was a very bitter opposition. Historically, people sat shiver on their children if they became a chassid, and it was considered like going out of the faith. I have to tell you that between my grandfather, who was a Litvak, and my father, who come again Hasidic background, they would have some roaring, respectful but very roaring battles when they would come over to issue on these issues. So I wonder if you have some comment on that.
Okay, so first of all, let's take the last point. It's true that there was vociferous opposition in the 70s, 80s, 90s, certainly as long as the Gaon was alive. But this opposition is localized. It's not everywhere. Even take the example of Pinsk, which is in Lita. Levi Yitzchak was the rabbi there for almost 10 years. The Gaon's disciples were pressuring the leaders of Pinsk to get rid of him, but they didn't. For almost 10 years, they resisted the pressure. And he was the rabbi of everybody. And there were Hasidim in Pinsk, and there were other people. I'm not going to call them mitnagdim. That's just one example, a very clear example. So that it wasn't everywhere that there was this tremendous fight. There were certain focus points like Brody and of course Vilna and other places where, yes, there was very strong conflicts, but other places where it was live and let live. So that's something to remember. Also, you have to remember we have very few sources about the conflict until the 1790s. In the 1770s and 80s, there are very few sources. If this was such a tremendous, all-consuming conflict, we would expect it would have left a lot more traces. Now, what you said about Sabbatianism. So this is a very long-standing question. What's the relationship between Hasidism and Sabbatianism? And we can't get into that now in a couple of minutes, except to say, there was a book, Chemdat Yamim, which is probably what you're thinking of when you say there were writings. Well, not everyone was convinced at the time that it was a Sabbatian book. Okay. So just because people were studying it doesn't make them Sabbatians. And yes, the Maggid was famous for quoting the Zohar, let atar panui minei. There's no place that God is not present. As you said, was the Gaon aware of this? I don't know. He doesn't. I'm not aware that he wrote anyway, saying that they're no good because they believe this and this. What he wrote was what I summarized. And again, there was no Chabad yet. There was Shner Zalman, but no Chabad.
Herbert. And then because Professor Rosman spoke about women, I think we need a question or two from
yes, how about it?
Okay.
Herbert.
It's always a pleasure to hear you talk.
Thank you.
But you describe the rise of Hasidism as a 19th century movement as opposed to merely an 18th century. But looking ahead, the Frankfurt Orthodox and their allies, who eventually become forces in the New World as well, must have had an immediate reaction to the conflict between the Vilna Gaon and the Hasidim. How did that play out as the 19th century unfolded and the 20th century began, in terms of the new era in which Chabad has flexed its muscles very strongly, but the opposition remains in place?
Well, I'm not sure what you're asking.
I'm asking about what goes on after the 19th century, our era.
Aha, okay. I'm not prepared to talk about that now. It's not something that I've researched, and I don't want to start making pronouncements.
Well, movement-wise, Chabad has made life miserable for the modern Orthodox in America.
Okay.
I think
That's
this is
sociology and
beyond the,
politics.
I
That's
think
not
this is
18th
beyond the
century.
scope of this lecture right now.
Okay, I'll let you get away with it.
Other,
Is there a woman in the house?
if not, I'll be the woman in the house.
Okay.
You might not be surprised because I work on 18th century. I mean, you've reframed Hasidism by saying that really it emerges as a movement in the 19th century. But obviously
it
matures. But even you will admit.
I'll admit it.
Okay, so even you will
18th,
admit that it emerges in the late
but it
18th
matures
century.
in the 19th.
Right. So then I think my
Just let me
question.
explain. Let me explain.
You're making my question stronger, so.
The conventional, good. The conventional narrative was always the classic period of Hasidism was from the Baal Shem Tov until the death of Shneur Zalman, the youngest of the Maggid's students. That was the classic Hasidism, and from there, degeneration. And I'm saying not quite the opposite, but that until the early 19th century, Hasidism was being formed, being created. And then from then on, you have the mature movement, okay?
Okay, so then I find your statement that Hasidism, that Kabbalah was languishing in the 18th century, and that one of the innovations of Hasidut is that it, revived Kabbalah to be much too strong. I mean, I find in my research.
I didn't say that. Shlomo Lutzker said that. That's his way of justifying Hasidism. I didn't say that was true.
I thought you said in your contributions that one of the contributions of Hasidut as a movement is that it revives Kabbalah.
Did I say that?
I think it's on one of your slides.
Neo-Kabbalism. That was
point number one.
Yes, but that was what Shlomo Lutzker claimed. Is that what Moshe Rosman is claiming? He said that he framed Hasidism as being
but I thought you were adopting
of Kabbalah.
And I thought
so your argument is with him.
But I thought you were adopting those points as what?
No.
Okay. Because I find that
I certainly don't see it as the Baal Shem Tov was a practical Kabbalist. I don't know how much he knew of contemplative Kabbalah.
Okay, but the Maggid certainly
probably more learned. But the Baal Shem Tov, I don't see him as a great Kabbalist.
Okay, because the frustration, in my research, have the other frustration. I have the frustration that I think Kabbalah was widespread and part of traditional Judaism. And many of the things that nowadays we think are Hasidic are not Hasidic necessarily, but they're
that's
Kabbalistic.
What I was trying to say about with Hasidism before Hasidism.
Right, but I'm also talking about in the generations that follow up till today. that many
Yes,
of the
yes, yes.
Kabbalistic customs that are then carried on by Hasidut are not necessarily Hasidic. It's just a Hasidic preserve these traditions.
I can only say amen. You're preaching to the converted.
Okay. Other Professor Brodsky, you want to take the prerogative?
I would
of the...
say, just to let people know, there's the raise your hand feature. So there.
I'm sorry.
We have one hand. So there's the
Rabbi
raise your hand
Ahuva, who I
feature.
don't see, but I see a hand. Yes? Are you there?
Thank you so much. I love these lectures. So there was somebody else in the chat who had the same question, which is, was the non-Jewish or Christian or larger world aware of some of these developments and some of these conflicts within the Jewish world during these developments? Were they aware, and how
When
did
they
they
become
react?
aware, that we can really point to is, first of all, the Russian government in 1804 declared that any 10 Jews can form a congregation, which was their way of saying that Hasidism is legitimate. So they were well aware of the conflict. Also in Vilna, several years before, when there was a conflict in Vilna between who was going to run the community, the Hasidim or the Mitnagdim, in the end, the Russian government supported, I forget which side now, and actually sent soldiers to the synagogue to support them. So yes, and certainly in the 19th century, there's tremendous interaction between the Hasidim and the government, and Marcin Wojcinski has written a whole book about it, and politics. So Zil Gomor.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. If there are no other questions, I am going to thank Professor Rosman for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
A wonderful series. And we hope to have others, and maybe we'll have Professor Rosman join us in person at some point. We'll be lucky enough.
Have lecture will travel.
Okay.
Yes, and both of these lectures will be available on our YouTube channel. It's in the chat. I put the link. I will also send it as an email to to everyone who registered, so that you can find it.
Okay, and we thank you for all taking time from your busy days and schedules, whether it's the evening or in the middle of the day, to participate. So thank you, and have a good afternoon or evening, as the case may be.